Okay, that's the thing I always forget to do is record it. My face. All right. Okay. Good morning. So today we're going to go ahead and get started. We are going to. No, it's written something. Introduce some basic taxonomic concepts today. So over the course of the semester, what we're going to do is really look at some basic classes of our vertebrates. So as we're going to find, vertebrates are largely anything with a backbone. Here at the very beginning of class, we're going to talk about a few that do not. So even though this is general zoology, of course, zoology thinking about anything with animals, we certainly cannot talk about all animals ever, because that would include both invertebrates, right, things without a backbone. This would largely be anything from like jellyfish and starfish to insects, as well as things with a backbone. Right, and so that would be most things I think most of us with our mammal bias tend to think about, right, cats, dogs, fishes, and that whole kabam. So if we were to talk about all those things, I'd really need you for a whole year. I'd love to do it, but that's a lot more time than we really have. So I'm going to be choosy, and we're just going to do the vertebrate half of things. So what I'm going to do is walk us through sort of like the history. Right, from oldest to newest of all of the things that are deliciously vertebrate. So what we're going to start with is how do we think about and categorize these things? So why are these things in the categories that they are? And we're going to have the same exact conversation in lab. Those of you that had Monday's lab, we already started this conversation. If you're in Tuesday's lab, we'll start this conversation next week. So we're going to, particularly these first couple units, really focus on what do we mean when we're talking about these things, and what are some important features and terms that you're going to need to use in order to move forward. Then as we continue to move forward, we'll tackle basically each group or class on its own and talk about, well, what are the major structures or features that give this class its identity? Okay, so how do we know this group belongs together? Okay? And why are these traits important for this group to function in its space? So what we're going to start with then is how is it we start classifying organisms? And we're going to get a lot of practice with this. So what does it mean when we talk about classifications? A lot of kind of Latin sounding flim-flam. Okay, so a lot of the basics for these organisms is all going to be the same. So when we're doing taxonomy, a lot of probably what might even sound familiar are these. Okay, so we might have even heard these terms before: domain, kingdom, phylum, right? Family, class, right? Genus, species. Okay, all of these are terms we use to organize organisms. Okay. So if we focus on just animal, okay, if I want to do animal versus plant versus fungus, okay, what level do I want to drop that on? This is probably dusty stuff from 1,000 years ago where your high school teacher said it once and then you never thought about it again. Just be domain. So domain feels like one of the most useless things ever. Does anybody know what domain is? So we don't talk about domain much. What is domain useful for? It's a good guess, and we rarely use it. And in this class, we won't talk about it really ever. So our domain refers to the cell type. What are our cell types? Good. There are actually three, but for what we care about, we're only really going to talk about the two. Prokarya and eukarya. The third one is like archaea, which is like weird extremophiles that live in like seabeds. All right, so what's the difference between a eukarya and a prokarya? What are we? Eukarya, right? Right. So what's a eukaryote? What kind of cells are those? Membrane bound. Good. Okay. That's one of the big key features, right? We've got membrane bound organelles. All right, prokaryotes, among other issues, do not have those sorts of things. Right? So these would be membrane bound organelles like mitochondria, endoplasm reticulum, they have all that sort of business. All right. So prokaryotes are like a lot of bacteria, for example, would fall under that pool. So not what we're interested in right now. All right, well, so that leads us to the next step, which is kingdom. So that's where we're going to go down. Ooh. Ooh. Too early for that kind of thing to be happening. So this is where we're going to put our animal. Or, okay, if we were doing something else. Right, any of that business. And that makes sense, right? We're thinking smallest to biggest. Small groupings, big groupings. Okay, cell types are really big groupings, right? You can have membranes around your organelles or you don't. There, I divided the entire world in half. All right, so now I'm taking a look at those membrane-bound organelle type cell things. I'm going to say, are you an animal? Are you a plant? Or are you a fungus? Foot. All right, so here we are. Everything we're going to talk about so far. Membrane-bound organelles, animals. So that leaves us sort of with this kind of business. And this is what we're going to spend the rest of the day talking about. Okay, remember I said we're going to narrow this down. We don't want to talk about invertebrates. We want to talk about stuff with a backbone. So how do we make sure that we're doing that? Okay, so that's what these last two categories are going to do for us. Okay, the phylum and subphylum business. Okay, so these terms are probably brand new to most of you. Okay, what they mean is basically the same concept, right? Fancy Latin terms. Okay, that just means how can we once again take our now group of animals and divide them again? So we make sure what we're looking at is just the group of organisms that we want to look at. Are you with me so far? This feel okay? Okay. So we're going to get a lot of practice with this, but this is kind of really a new concept, right? It's unlikely a lot of you have gotten to play actively with using taxonomy before. I always hit that button. Okay, so the first thing we want to look at is that phylum. And the phylum we're going to look at, before we look at vertebrates, are what are called chordates. Oops, Yeehaw! Chordata. We're going to find that chordata, okay, is a very big group. Okay, and they're basically pre-vertebrates. So this is our phylum. Okay, so here we are. We're going to split things again. How do I get rid of things like bugs? Okay, we're going to pull off a bunch of stuff. You're still animals, okay, but I want to get rid of anything that doesn't have any kind of structural component. All right, so then let's sit down and look at what does it mean to be under phylum Chordata? What kind of traits would these organisms have? Okay, so everything I have pictured here is a representative of that group. Okay, so there's a lot of variation on a theme, and that makes sense, right? I just said this is a big pool. That was what we said before, right? Shush, go back. Okay. These are big. Hey, you rude thing. Yeah. Click, you butthead. These are big things. Right, and as we keep going down, we're going to have things like class and family and species. And these are small things. Right, we know species is very small. By the time we get down to something like species, I'm going to tell you this is an individual organism. Right? But when we're talking about phylum, this is big. We're taking large pools of organisms. So here we have a representation of a large pool of organisms that makes a chordate. So let's start looking at the list of traits that identifies or makes up what a chordate is, which is a pool bigger than our vertebrates. Okay, so what is phylum Chordata? So if you're going to belong to our big pool, okay, smaller than all of the animals in the world, okay, we're going to get rid of some of our invertebrates. They're bigger than vertebrates. What exactly does that mean? So you've got 6 major features that our chordates are going to have. Try to move this to the other side here. There we go. The first feature we have is what's called a notochord. It's the namesake of our group. And notochord is like a pre-vertebrate. Okay, we don't have any bone. Okay, these aren't huge structures, but they're really fantastically important. Okay? If we think about the notochord, which at its peak here is the dorsal stiffening rod, okay, dorsal just meaning back, I think like dorsal fin. Okay, so this is just something that's running along the back side of the organism. There's my drawing feature again. Stop using black. Okay, so here's our notochord here, kind of in this, I don't know, baby poop brown color. Hey, this is running along the back of the organism. So if we compare this, so if we were to draw the same sort of organism without it, okay, we can immediately imagine the benefit of having that sort of stiffening rod in it. Okay. An organism without this notochord is going to be very floppy. Right? Kind of like a jellyfish. It's just a sort of floppy. Now, jellyfish are great. They live their best life. They're obviously very successful organisms. But the negative of being all floppity, right, and being anywhere, right, but particularly in the water is you have very little control over your life. Right? You're flopping. So you can move. I can move. I can flop. Okay? But it's not super directed. Okay? So I can kind of get where I'm going, but it's going to take a lot longer to get there. And then if a big wave comes along, I'm going to go, right? And that's what happens with jellyfish and plankton. A big wave comes along and and we're going this way now. But, get a workout up here. Okay? Once I have this, okay, I now can straighten my body. Okay? I have structure. I can point my face. So now, when I move, I can point my face in a direction, I can move in that direction. Okay? So for the first time, okay, creatures that have this kind of can take control of their own destiny. So they can orient themselves. And that's a big deal. Makes them more efficient and better at whatever they're doing. Moving, hunting, whatever it is. Yes, flip the page. Okay, same jazz with what we call the post-anal tail. Okay, and name is as descriptive as it sounds. So, said anus or cloaca as appropriate. And then past that, there is some sort of loopy tail feature. Okay. So, other organisms, the body ends here. And this is pretty common. And there are a lot of organisms. We can picture things like worms, for example. Okay? The butt is the very end of the organism. And again, they're successful. They crawl along the bottom and they live their best life. We're not judging them or body shaming. But again, this is a very successful feature, right? Because at this point now, we've created a structure or fundamentally a tool that exists exclusively as a paddle and a rudder. Right? Think of it like a motor, right, and a propeller off the back of the boat. Right? That works so well because it's basically an addition to the boat that helps move it, right, off the back. And that's the same thing here. Now we have extra special organs that exist just to help move and direct it along. Okay, worms are crappy swimmers. Fish are very good swimmers. Okay, for two reasons. We have some stiffening, and we have the tail. Now, this particular fish I have up here, of course, has a backbone. But the fish I had in the last picture does not. We still just have that stiffening rod. We flip back. Right, and we have that post-anal tail. Good so far?
These aren't vertebrates.
So we'll talk about that. So something like this is not a vertebrate. But something like this would be. So we are getting a little ahead. That's a good question. So you can be both a vertebrate and a chordate, but not necessarily. So that will come down to this, right? So as we think about how classifications work, it's a bit like, really good question. You guys are like very engaged. So let's think about fruit. Okay, so we're classifying things when we think about fruit. Like fruit is a really big pool, right? So fruit is the biggest pool we can do things in. Okay, so an apple is a fruit. Okay, so all apples are fruit. Okay, but, okay, right, so all vertebrates are chordates, but not, all fruit are apples. Right? And that's going to be the same thing here. So all chordates, and then our vertebrates are going to be a subphylum. It's going to be a smaller group, kind of like apples. Right? So all vertebrates will be chordates. Right? All apples will be fruits. Okay, but not all fruits, not all chordates will be vertebrates. Chordate is our phylum that we're working with. And our subphylum will be vertebrate. We just haven't gotten that far yet. Correct.
Does invertebrate fall under the chordate as well? Or is it just
it would not.
Okay.
Right. So her question is, does invertebrate fall under chordates? So what we've done here, and this is our big key, we've done domain eukarya. This got rid of our bacteria, right? Eukarya. Ooh. I think I got really excited there. I kind of did the banana thing, didn't I? Okay. So I got rid of like bacteria. And then we are kingdom, Animalia. Listen, the spelling's not going great today. That got rid of our plants and our fungi, right? And now where we are right now is Chordata. Oh, and that one I spelled right. Okay. So our Chordata is just getting rid of our invertebrates. Right? We just want to look at things that have internal structure of some kind. So this is just going to negate anything that has no internal structure. Right? Insects, jellyfishes, anything like that. All of our invertebrates. Okay, so we haven't specified anything about our actual detailed vertebrates yet. We're just getting rid of all of the inverts. And we'll talk about what the difference between a chordate and a vertebrate is in a few minutes. Does that help? Is that a little bit more clear? Okay, really great questions. Okay. So feature 3 you need to be a non-invertebrate, right, a chordate. So we have what's called an endostyle, right? Endostyle just meaning inside. Okay. So some sort of feature that allows you to capture and ingest food inside your body. Okay, and there's a lot of variety on this. Okay, the picture I happen to have up here is a sea squirt. Okay, and the key here is we have, right, a separate mouth and anus. And we don't always see that in invertebrates. Right? If you picture something like a jellyfish or a sea star, right, their mouth and anus is the same opening, which sounds terrible. At least we can agree to that, right? All right, so here, and this is just sort of one of the most reductive forms that we see in chordates, right? We just have a mouth and basically a giant net that's going to filter out small particulates. Right? Very much kind of like a giant baleen whale does. Right? Really small pieces, filter them in, and then we can absorb and crush the small bits. And then like sort of everything else, whatever we don't keep in the stomach, that goes up the anus. It's all the same kind of system. Okay, and here immediately we can already imagine, just like the notochord, if we think about a vertebrate, we know that vertebrates have much more sophisticated processes than this. Okay, same sort of deal as we think about pharyngeal slits. Okay, so we'll see the word pharyngeal a few times. You've probably heard this word and not realized it. Pharyngeal comes from pharynx, which is basically this on your head face region. Okay, kind of where your voice box sits. Okay, so we have a pharynx. You can kind of hear it fuzz a little when you talk. There's a lot of small bone structures, same kind of area where your ear bones are sitting. It's where a lot of the conduits sit if you have those hearing aids, the new ones that sit behind your ears. Those really cool ones that don't have to sit in your ears anymore. So pharyngeal slits are basically like pre-gills and ear bones. Right? Because gills and ear bones, as we're going to find, are actually the same structure, which is super cool. But pharyngeal slits are still really neat. So these are basically slits in an organism that exist for respiration, but they don't have bony structures to support them. So this is one of the keys that we're going to see. Now, both the endostyle and the pharyngeal slits are really key components. Because if we think about our invertebrate organisms, worms, for example, or jellyfish, right, they don't have either of these pieces. Now, they breathe and eat, living their best life, right? But, for example, again, we picture our wormy friend, right? That poor little creature is fundamentally living off of diffusion. Same thing with our jellyfishes and a lot of these other organisms. And if you're living substantially off of things like diffusion, both for food and for respiration, you have one fundamental problem. Right? If we think back to physiology class or Bio 130, right? The problem with diffusion is you're limited on size when you do this, right? Diffusion can only go so far. You have a surface area to volume ratio problem, right? You can only move around whatever it is you're doing so well. Okay? Plus, remember for these first two, they already suck at moving around. So they're bad at capturing food, right? Because they're flippity floppity. Okay? And they're bad at actually getting the food or oxygen into their body, because they're dependent on diffusion. So what we've done with all of our upgrades so far is allow the organism to be more directed at getting the things. Right? I can move my body in a directed manner. And now I'm more efficient. I'm better at getting food in. Okay? And better at getting oxygen in. Okay? So this means I'm a more active and successful organism, predator, hunter, okay, within the space that I'm in. I'm a more powerful organism, force to be reckoned with. Just go. Okay, next up on our agenda, if we look back at this little guy, remember this like baby poop brown thing was our notochord. And that served to give us strength and direction. I can point my face. The other thing that we have is this little yellow business. So remember, dorsal means my back. So the fact that it's the dorsal hollow nerve cord means it's the most dorsal thing. So it's the most back. This is the furthest towards the back on this organism. So it's this, let's call it mustard colored kind of thing. In this organism, these are not actually the color, of course. All right, and this is also a big feature. Okay, so if we consider once again things like our jellyfish, okay, jellyfishes have nerves. Okay, all invertebrates have nerves. But most of these organisms have what's called neural nets. Okay, so all of their nerves are sort of spread out around their bodies. And there's some benefits and some disadvantages to that system. But what we're really seeing here is a connected neural system. This ends up fundamentally functioning a bit like a pre-brain. Okay. So what we have here is a pre-centralized nervous system. So a centralized area where all of the nerves in our organism are coming together to send and process stimuli. Okay, which means that we're moving towards the ability for this organism to be able to process and make decisions. Okay, so it's going to be better orienting itself, understanding pain and fear inputs. And much more the way that we see things done now. Now, this is pretty reductive, right? There's no brain here. Okay, we don't have major stimuli pathways, right? Certainly we don't see eyes, we're not seeing major touch sensations, we're not seeing the development of these things, but it is a very good start. And it certainly can taste and smell and all of that sort of business, right? So it has a way to take the inputs that it is getting, store them, and process them. Okay, now, again, there's a downside. If we imagine our wormy friend, that's been another example we've been working through. Again, it has more of a neural net. So it doesn't have one centralized place where all the stimulus is going, where it's getting decision making. Okay, makes it a little more problematic for it to respond to stimuli. That being said, you can cut a worm in half, right? Part of that worm can keep going because it's not all kept in one place. You can't cut this poor little guy in half and it's not going to keep going. So, a little bit of benefit and disadvantage there. All right, one more, right? We had 6. This is 5. So last but not least, we have what are called myomeres. Okay, this prefix of myo literally just refers to muscle. Okay, so one of the first times then we see here is repetitive blocks of muscular tissue. Now this is pretty small, right? Ultimately, this is going to expand. We have repetitive blocks of muscular tissue, right? If you imagine your legs, if you've eaten meat, right? If you imagine a thick steak, if you've eaten fish, certainly fish have a really good example of what that repetitive pattern looks like. It's a much more expanded version of the vertebrate version, okay? But we do have a very small version of this, okay? And again, this is a big deal. If we're picturing a worm or a jellyfish, right? There's really not much to speak of there. Does that mean they're not successful? No. But a lot of this goes back to having that notochord, okay? Having a stiffening feature in an organism gives something for muscles to attach to. And this is a big deal because not only now can I point my face, I can now also have a much stronger body to be effective in the movement that I want to go into. Certainly compared to, again, what we're trying to get rid of, are those invertebrates, right? My flippity floppity worm. Sorry, little worm. Right, so my big key take home here is we're pulling out all of those invertebrates, and I have a lot of features here that are going to make me stronger and more successful. I'm more active, more directed, and more powerful. So I'm a better feeder, I'm a better hunter. Okay, than those organisms are likely to be. Okay, and that's what sets the phylum Chordata apart. Okay, any questions about chordates before we move on to think about how our subphylum is pulled apart from these guys? Okay, all of these features make sense in how they support and give advantages to our chordates and how it separates them from the invertebrate group. Yeah.
So, since like the vertebrae are all part of the chordata, like they all have these 6 features?
Great question. Yeah. So his question is, since vertebrates are part of chordates, do they all have these features? And that is correct, right? So we will expect our vertebrates to also have these features. In some cases, correct, they're going to either upgrade them, but you will straight up see some of these features as well, right? And we'll get to see this in lab, right? When we look at a vertebra, you'll actually see the notochord inside, which is super cool. And then in some cases, you're correct. It's just a straight up upgraded version. But you can't have both a stomach and an endostyle. And we'll talk about that here as well. Good questions. Anything else before we start clarifying our vertebrates? All right, great questions. All right, so let's look at our vertebrates. So here now we've stepped down, right? We were domain eukarya, right? Kingdom, Animalia. We just finished phylum, Chordata. And so now we're going to slip down into subphylum, right? This is like, let's look at apples. Okay, so remember, as we think about vertebrates, right, all vertebrates are chordates. All vertebrates are animals. Okay, but not all chordates are vertebrates, right? Not all animals are vertebrates. Right? Not all fruit are apples. Okay, and we'll have several examples for you to look at and touch in lab when we're going through real examples for you guys to handle here. So the key when we're thinking of vertebrates is we are going to have these chordate features and we're going to be upgrading. Okay, so what can we do to improve on the features that we just talked about? Okay, and that's going to be really our big theme throughout the semester. Okay, it's all about the upgrades. Okay, what makes this class different? What allowed them to move onto land? What allowed them to move into this space? What makes them have that advantage? Okay, and that's what we're going to focus on for each group, because it gives them a tangible, small set of things that we can focus on and handle. So, let's pick 6 things. What are the 6 most important things that allow us to focus on with vertebrates? All right, so we still have dorsal hollow nerve cord. That was a chordate feature, and it's not going away, right? We know we're chordates, right? We're vertebrates, so we have to be chordates. And running up the back of our spine, we know that we have nerves here, which is why when we get really bad back injuries, we can't walk anymore, because that same dorsal hollow nerve cord gets pinched or broken. It's the same dorsal hollow nerve cord. We can do it better. So how did we do it better as vertebrates? Well, one of the things that we did, so here's a lamprey. This is something you guys will get to handle in lab, is we added a brain. And we don't body judge, so here's our lamprey's brain, right under that little white arrow. I see body judgment in this classroom. All right, so here's our brain. Okay, so the key here is now, in addition to having that nerve cord that's pooling and centralizing stimuli, we now have a whole organ dedicated to memory storage, stimuli response, okay? And it also allows for the development of multicellular sense organs. In other words, things like eyes, right? Olfactory organs, what allows you to smell. Okay. For some organisms, this also might be like the pineal gland, which allows you to sense light and dark. Touch, okay, whatever the case is, all of these organs can be really, really well more developed. Okay, because there's a whole organ now dedicated to dealing with those feelings, if you will. Right, buddy? Okay, so we still have the whole dorsal hollow nerve cord, but it's not going to terminate in that brain. All signals go to one supercomputer. Fundamentally, yes, it does, and can be considered a central nervous system. Although if we think about our poor little lamprey, that may be giving it a lot of credit. Okay, remember we thought before we talked about pharyngeal slits? So those still exist, but we're going to give them a formal upgrade. So in our aquatic organism, we're going to have true gills. And then in our terrestrial, I couldn't come up with the word terrestrial, really? We have ear bones. So we end up with what's called pharyngeal arches. So we're going to give structure to the pharyngeal system. Okay. Now I want to be clear that I say structure, this does not mean bone. Okay, it can be bone, but it can also be cartilage. So be very careful that vertebrate does not mean calcium phosphate. It does not have to be bone. And be careful that you don't get that stuck in your head. Okay, it just means there's structure there. Okay, so in our fishes, right, we have this nice arch set that goes with it. Okay, this is going to increase surface area. We're going to talk about surface area a lot. The more surface area you have, right, just like the mitochondria, the more surface area you are, the better you are at doing something. Okay. When we get on land, we're not going to use the system anymore. But we are still going to use the structures. And those structures will end up becoming your little ear bones, right? Because it's in the same spot. Might as well not waste it, right? All right. Now we already had some kind of stomach system. That's still there, right? We had the endostyle for digestion. So the key here is we're going to expand that and make sure that the stomach is doing what's called extracellular digestion. Okay, meaning if we think about the stomach, right, we're using stomach acid, right, to break things down. If we think about our small intestine, right, we're using bile to break things down and then absorb. Okay, So that's extracellular digestion, right? We're not breaking things down within a cell, right? You're not breaking the food down within the cells of the intestine or the stomach, right? Things are getting broken down before you absorb them. And that's the major key here. So the big benefit here is you can then consume much larger food items, right? We don't have to eat little bits of plankton. You can eat a whole cheeseburger. And those big chunks of cheeseburger then are dissolved in your stomach and dissolved in your intestine into those little bits before your stomach lining or your intestinal lining have to take them on. Okay, so this extracellular digestion, your stomach acid and your bile really break things down in a way that allow you to take on much bigger prey, big cheeseburger, large fish, okay, small frogs, whatever it is your delicacies are. Okay? But if I'm taking on bigger prey, I can take on better food sources, better energy sources, wider variety of food. Okay, I will go ahead and stop there. I have your Socrative up, right? Remember, we do need to do our Socratives. Ignore that. Keep big. So remember, our room is RNet 9. You should sign in with your last name, comma, first name. And let's make, I should have the one up now. It should be asking you for the teacher's question. My usual, if you've not been in my class before, my usual MO is to have like the last slide or something on the last slide as the answer to the teacher's question. Did I screw it up? I did. My bad on that. All right, try it now. My bad. I had the wrong class up. Sorry, guys. There we go.